Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today, we are going to be talking about personal primary sources to use in student learning, kind of part 3 in an ongoing series of my belief that primary sources should be the heart of any social studies-based curriculum or learning. And in light of the current environment, thinking about what students might have at home. And a lot of this should be transferable, again, even when they're back in your classroom. These are still types of sources that kids would be able to interact with at kind of an entry or beginner level. So we're looking, and I apologize for those who've done the previous 2 sessions, a little bit at the beginning here will be a little bit of a repeat. I'm working off the definition of disciplinary literacy and social studies as adapted, as I pulled from Jeffrey Noakes. He looks at disciplinary literacy through a historical lens. I've changed it. And so what we're really looking for is the ability to construct meaning with multiple genres. So today I'm going to focus on a wide range of different pieces. So we're looking print, non-print, visual, oral, video, audio, multimodal. We want to critically evaluate those texts within the context of that work that the experts in the field have previously done. We're going to use text as evidence, and we're going to create multiple types of text. And so again, really focusing on, I think it's Timothy Shanahan when talking about elementary literacy. He says, yes, storybooks are great, but a steady diet of anything will make you sick. And I think it's the same thing. I think oftentimes with primary sources, we fall into a pattern of like written pieces, like reading journals, reading this, reading that. And there is such a wide variety of things that we can pull in. And we really want to focus in on that critical evaluation piece. So Sam Weinberg's work, and then the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, it's reading and or thinking like a historian, right? We need to attack these texts like somebody in that field would do. And then what we're doing is attacking that text to look for evidence so that then we can create or share that understanding in that discipline. And so what this is, it really is this end result. Noakes talks about a variety of different ways that kids can interact with the text. And I just always settle on and we focus on being a criticalist. Once information is provided, we want kids to not jump to any conclusion right off the bat. They shouldn't jump to a conclusion as good or bad until they've had a chance to properly evaluate the text or texts, and then think about which of these texts or pieces of evidence is the most superior. So in order to do that, they should be active in the process of disciplinary thinking, which we're going to focus on today. Again, you have to give them the room to construct their own independent interpretation of an event different from others. And this is one of the things, again, I'm going to continue to highlight as teachers, we oftentimes want to fall in the idea of a right answer, that sage on the stage, but really working on being that guide on the side, the rhyming words that make it easy to remember, right? It's okay if there is not a specific right answer. What we really want is for kids to be able to work with a process to show their thinking, to then engage in that work with us. They're going to struggle being aware of the strategies. So that's where we have to model that work for them. And then when they reach a conclusion, we want to make sure that it's always an evidence-based claims. And that's why we're working with the primary sources to find that evidence. Again, this is always my go-to. I love the Stanford History Education Group chart. The 4 key skills: sourcing, contextualization, corroboration, and close reading. Questions that you can ask kids as prompts. Students should be able to, as learning targets on the front of your board, and then little exit slipped or writing pieces for a written component. If you do go to the Stanford History Education Group, the SHEG website in the bottom right-hand corner, this chart is downloadable for free. They also have posters that talk about, they put sourcing onto a poster, contextualization, etc., with those supporting questions on there. And so I can tell you, when I was in Madison, one of the things that we did was all of our high school classroom, social studies classrooms, we worked to get copies of these posters up in each of the classrooms, because this is the work as a reminder that kids should be doing and the questions they should be asking as they interact with the charts. All right, back to this again. I come back to this over and over again because I think sourcing is such a valuable piece and such an important, such a confusing piece, right? Because we can look at things so many different ways. And again, my apologies for those who've kind of seen this before to begin with, but like looking at the idea of Google or Wikipedia, and is that okay? Is Wikipedia a reliable source? Is it okay if you're actually going down to the footnotes and tracking sourcing that way? And in the bottom right-hand corner, like we have truth. We have truth that's not correct, truth that's a lie. The Dewey defeats Truman, the famous picture of the Chicago Daily Tribune, where that was an actual picture, even though it was inaccurate. The newspaper did print that, he did hold it up. And so there is reliability to that, but understanding that's not an answer, it's just part of evidence. Dewey did not defeat Truman, but this is part of the story. And then I love the pieces about snake oil and advertisements. In the upper right-hand corner, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. I like to tell people facts are an amazing thing. You can prove just about anything with facts. And if you word your surveys just right or manipulate the data just right, you can make it seem as though doctors are promoting smoking, which is not the case, even though it's somewhat implied in this, that doctors do smoke Camels. So just thinking about whatever information's being in front of you, the first thing you need to do is stop and source the information. Who's saying it? Why are they saying it? And what is the purpose of it? So we're going to look at evaluating the source. And again, this hopefully will be my last apology for those of you who've seen this. You're going to see on the next slide, I put a different twist on this now. But we're looking at the idea of a historical question of who was present at the signing of the Declaration of Independence and having to think through the sourcing of who's more reliable, a Hollywood movie in 2001 or a book written in 1999. And we've talked about this before, that given the idea that Hollywood does take liberties and historians writing books tend to be a little more thorough in their research, that source two would be the more commonly accepted answer, although in previous sessions we've talked about how you can kind of pull this apart. But then, so my question for you is, so where does this idea interact with kids in their own life, where the source matters? Have you ever had circumstances in your own life or with students where you tell the kids the assignment's due on Wednesday, and then somebody comes into class and says, no, I talked to Craig. Craig said it was due on Thursday. Because the reliability of the source does matter. Those were both two people, maybe in the same classroom at the same time, the teacher and the student. That doesn't mean that they're equally valuable as a source. So one thing that I would ask you to do at this time when having kids think about the source itself is have students watch the news or read the news. So whether they're watching it on TV, internet, newspapers, magazines, and have them make a conscious effort to watch a second channel, read a second newspaper, magazine, website, etc., and to just compare. And it's not a judgment piece on it. This is not a, well, that's leans left media and a leans right media. But just by making sure that they watch a second type or a second source, they have to start to think about what the source means. Because oftentimes we turn on the channel, the news comes on, we just passively take it in, not really stopping to think about who is behind that. So a simple thing, again, to have your kids do is, if you're in that process right now of assigning them things, whether it's tech or no tech, just ask them to watch the news and write a reflection, but they have to watch or read two separate news pieces. And just the ideas of what was the headline piece, what was the leading piece of information, so if it's the 5 o'clock news or 6 o'clock news, what was the first piece of news? And then if it's two newspapers, what's the headline? Are they focusing on the same thing? And then in that first 30 seconds on TV or in the first paragraph, what's the lead idea? What is the data that's being out there, right? Because you can use facts to prove anything. Is it up to 25 people infected with COVID or down to 25 people with COVID, right? Because you can, add that into it. So at this time, either in the chat box or unmuting yourself, what are some other things that you could do with your students at this time or in face-to-face in the classroom to have them have to pause and think about who is the source of the information? I will give you guys some time to respond.
Joe, specific to remote learning or just classroom use in general?
Whichever you'd like to go with. I mean, if you're thinking right now and have a remote learning idea, great. If this sparks a curiosity or something in your mind for when they're in your classroom, that's great as well. Leslie says information they're getting about their school, about the school closure. Leslie, what might be two different sources that they might be getting that information from? Pamela said kids love to watch YouTube, compare their favorite with a news article. So find a YouTube video about a topic and relate it to what would be kind of more standard news based. So shoot, I'm sorry, I forget what the A stands for, so I apologize. Information the kids are getting about grades and doing their homework. What would be the different sources of information? I'm assuming one source of information for your students would be you. Is there another source of information where they might be getting things from? Leslie talking again about the school closure. So what is the news saying versus what is the school's email or website saying? Okay. And which one of those would be considered more reliable? We're probably assuming the school stuff if we're talking specific to the school. Okay, so one source about your work would be the teacher versus peers or siblings or friends from other districts. Okay, so that'd be an interesting approach. Are different districts doing different things? And should that matter to a kid, right? You know, if a teacher or if a student tells you, well, they're not doing it that way over in this district, that might be true, but that really should not impact what your expectations in their class were. And it does matter a lot to the kids. Yeah, it absolutely does. Bree says the Library of Congress activity looking at the photo of kids playing baseball. There's a treasure trove of newspapers going way back in time. Yep, so as a historical piece, anytime you have a major event in history that you're studying, if you go look for those newspapers, you can see what the newspapers did at the time. One thing you can do is the Newseum website. They have the #1 newspaper in each state. They post the front page on their website. So you get a snapshot of all 50, right? And if you have a major incident in Maine, that may only show up on the Maine newspaper as opposed to other ones, which would help students understand the locality of news. But if you do have a major event, how is that being covered in Los Angeles versus Chicago versus Miami versus, right? Because even just that snapshot of now, people are taking a different approach to different topics. Is it always when relying somewhere on online text? Craig, are you saying the internet's not always true? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Like that could go for I still have a older textbook that sometimes we use in class when we're in school, but which is more reliable probably than just a random page they open online. But like, is this textbook actually unbiased? Like who wrote it? What might other textbooks say about the exact same incident or war, or another textbook from the United States? Or what about textbooks in other countries? How would they view the exact same incidents?
I think it was the New York Times did a headline piece, I think it was January, February, where they compared the 8 textbooks used around the country in terms of like California and Texas. And like they compared page 87 in California and Texas. Some things were omitted on different pages. And what did that mean? And one of the things that I've used as an example, when I was in college, we had to cross-examine a history textbook from England and from the United States. And the like in the United States, the American Revolution is a big chapter and the War of 1812 is a small piece of our history. In England, it's flipped. They don't look at the American Revolution as the like end all be all. They don't see the end of the war until 1812. And so the American Revolution is a small part and the War of 1812 is a bigger part, right? So that does matter. Cindy gives the example, I once delayed starting a class a minute or two and chatted with a student in front of the class and then asked the students to write down what had happened during the first 2 minutes. Groups of students notice different things, right? Point of view. One of the things that I've given as a thing for elementary teachers to do is at the end of the first day of school, have the kids write about their first day. And then in the next day, just talk about it. Like, kids are gonna have all sorts of different things. And it's that introduction, right? It was everybody's first day, they were all there, but some kids will focus on lunch or resource or recess or different things that they were doing. And there is no right answer to what the first day was. It's just all part of that experience for everybody. And that's why you need multiple perspectives and multiple sources to compile. So our second one, we've talked about comparing like who's the interviewer and the interviewee. So what was slavery like in South Carolina? Does it matter if the interviewer is a Black man versus a white woman? And in doing this previously, we've talked about that you're probably going to get some more honesty or more clarity if a former slave is talking to a Black man. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but there's also some concerns. But then, so what is that relation then with students? And my go-to always is like, right, he said, she said. Two people, you know, we don't always have that exact set of facts that former slave, the former enslaved person who's talking about their story is going to have probably different versions depending on who they're telling. Are they telling a teacher? Are they telling a principal? Are they telling a parent? Are they telling their friend? And why does that matter? So similar to what Cindy was just saying, you could have students at home if there's an event. I mean, it doesn't even have to be a big event. It can be lunch, right? If they have siblings or parents, have them go interview and be like, so tell me about lunch. Like, what happened today at lunch? And just those different, because people will focus on different pieces depending on who the piece is. And if they really wanted to get into that version of what Stanford's saying, right, it would be the same person being interviewed by two different people, which may or not be the best fit. But again, it's that approach to, there's too much information for us to fully share. So we are always kind of picking and choosing what parts we're going to share. And so if you were to have even a mundane event like lunch and then get done and interview everybody who was at lunch, what would they say? And a lot like what Cindy was just sharing as that example. So what are some other examples where you could see this with your students right now as part of a distance learning environment or back in your classroom where you would have to, again, attack that sourcing piece, understanding that people are going to have different perspectives even if they're in the same room. And Cindy will give you credit for already having done this one, since your last one was a perfect example. So feel free to unmute yourself or put into the chat box. Craig says journals. I'm going to have you hold on to that one for 1 second, Craig. That's going to be a really good one for the next piece because it's that internal dialogue of a student. How can we have them work with multiple different perspectives of the same event? He said, she said, lunch. To help students understand when somebody's version of the story is different, it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, right? And kids get this all the time, the he said, she said, the fight on the playground. While a kid at some level might be lying to not get in trouble, I mean, the reality of it is people are just processing things so differently that it's just their version, their view of it. Pamela says, back in the classroom, my students used the Nat Geo magazine and a Smithsonian magazine to view the people highlighted in women's suffrage. The women highlighted were different. There were no people of color in National Geo. Wow, that's a good one, Pamela. So if a group is doing a highlight of women's history, women's suffrage, African American History Month, right? A lot of those pieces, who do they elevate up? When I was in my previous position in Madison, they asked me if I would do a daily trivia of Black History Month in February. They wanted to do it on social media. They wanted to do a new question every day. And then I would like attach the learning. And I said, I will be more than happy to do it, but I refuse to do any questions where the answer was Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks, because the kids had that piece already, right? Because that's what keeps getting surfaced. Bree says, looking at MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail, which responds to an open letter from clergy. So Bree, am I understanding correctly? You look at both MLK's letter and then, okay, right? So you have religious leaders in the same place and the same time who have very different takes on what's going on. So this oh, no, that's okay. No problem, Bree. So the last one, we've talked about memory. Do you interview an 80-year-old Holocaust survivor, or do you look at a map of the concentration camp? And this is meant to highlight the idea that memory is faulty. It's not a really good way to look at the world around us. So the example I had that Craig kind of went to is, if your students are journaling, have them reflect on what happened before they go back and look. So if you've had them writing a daily journal entry, have the assignments, like on this Friday, say, what do you remember about the first day of journaling, or that first day of distance learning? What was it like? What was on your mind? What do you think was the key, right? So now that's like a month back. If you've had them from the beginning, it's the same person. It's this, right? I know it's a month, but you'd think at some level people would be able to remember, but I'm telling you, they probably won't. If you were to say, what was the number one thing you highlighted in your journal on the first day, they'll probably struggle. And it's not right or wrong again. So have them engage in that activity.
Joe, can I just interject for a second?
Absolutely.
One of my activities that I have them do on, I can't remember which choice board is, they have to reflect on what it was like in school before before we left, what a school day was like, and they have to compare and contrast what it's like now. I mean, along the similar lines.
I would be curious if you asked your kids, what was our school schedule, our daily schedule when we're in class, right? It's something, how many days? You probably got in 120 days more by the time.
Yeah. And a lot of my kids, it's interesting that, because we had such a, predictable schedule, that I was talking to one of my students this morning, and he keeps the same like morning routine. He does his math and then he does his reading. So it's interesting that we've created such creatures of habit that they like to do the same. A lot of them get most of their morning work done and post it on Seesaw for me, and then they can have the rest of the day to do their stuff. So it's neat to see that they're still kind of keeping the same thing, even though they're not at school. So it'd be neat to see how many of them are still doing that through the journals.
I'm curious how many of them could remember the class schedule prompted, like right now, if you were to just say. And the ones who've kept it, that would be super easy, right? They'd be like, oh no, I've kept that. But just being X number of days out. And again, it's just that idea that, if they got it wrong or said, they're not lying. They're doing their best to try to put their memories back together. And that's oftentimes what happens when we interview people. And that's why the written journal or photography and stuff is such a precious part of primary sources. So thank you for sharing, Jen. That's a great example of just how, again, we may work with the world. So if you have your kids doing any sort of their own journaling, that would be a way to have them reflect. Their journal is a primary source. And how do you have them interact with it besides just saying, well, just go back and read it? Have them try to remember what they wrote and see how they do. Because again, all of this is just part of the evidence piece, right? This is nobody's right necessarily, nobody's wrong. If a student can't remember Jen's classroom schedule, that doesn't mean they were lying or that they weren't there. It's just part of what it is. And so again, that idea of write about your first day of class, just because mine was different than Bree's, different than Cindy, different than Jen, than Pam's and Craig, that doesn't mean any of us are right or wrong. It's all a bit of what we pull together to tell the story of that day. And then, so this example that I always use is General Dwight D. Eisenhower's letter about the failure of D-Day, which did not happen. He just wrote both a we won version and we lost version. And so to have this, if you source it out, there's more than just that sourcing, right? Having to understand the context. That just because General Dwight D. Eisenhower wrote a letter saying that D-Day failed does not mean D-Day failed. Just because Harry Truman's holding up a picture that says Dewey defeats Truman does not mean that Dewey defeats Truman. These are all parts. And this is where you can help kids understand that narrative, that there is not ever really going to be one piece where you can say, look, I've got this one piece that proves it, it's done, we need to move on. And the more you can help kids understand that piece by pushing on that, that goes back to, I think it was some of what Craig was saying, right? Just because you find something online, you click on something, doesn't mean that that's it. I have a news feed app on my phone that last night sent me a message that said the White House is selling $100 coins commemorating coronavirus. And I was like, what? So I did my parallel research. I went to Google and said, is it true? And they said, no. It's the Secret Service something, which was bought out and privatized like in 2014. So if you don't really follow the thread enough, you would think the White House is now selling a $100 commemorative coin about COVID-19, which is not true. There is a coin for sale, but it is not from the White House. So making sure you're bringing in more than one perspective. Okay, so thinking about your students, again, we talked about the journaling. If you have your students, if there was a student planner or something that they had to fill out, help them understand that just because something's written still does not mean it's accurate, right? We've talked about being written is better than memory. If they have a journal, have them thumb back to September, October, November. Is it accurate? Because they put in the journal, go to the football game tonight. Does that mean they went? Did they do something that didn't show up in that journal? Does it say research paper due on Friday? Does that mean it was due on Friday? Has anybody in this room ever delayed an assignment? Absolutely, right? Like things change, snow days happen. But so now we're even pushing on the idea, just because the student wrote it down, it still doesn't mean it's 100% accurate. So what are some other examples? I threw some quick ones about like personal events or homework or snow days. What are some other things, if you had your students, if they had access, if they had a planner journal type thing, what other things would you ask them to look for and reflect on to help them understand that this piece of primary source is just part of their story?
Joe, ask the question again, please.
So if your students had a student planner, and I gave you a couple of examples, what would be some things you would ask them to think about or look at to help them understand that even their own written planner of events might not be accurate?
Oh, if they checked done. There's a column that says done, and the kids will half of the time check that off before they ever go home for the day.
Or a lot of them will say that they've done it and then they have their parents sign it. Like, or is that
a parent's signature doesn't indicate that they did the work.
right? Or is that really their parent's signature? I've had third graders that have like shown me something that they've completed, And then, sorry, I just saw your thing, Craig. And that's not their parent signature.
I mean, I would love that if you had those in there, like have the kids go back and say, so what does this mean, right? Parent signature, take a look. Tommy or Joey or Susie are like, tell me about this, right? Because I think anytime we can just have kids reflect on that fact, I think that helps them have that healthy skepticism of primary sources. Hopefully not that every single parent signature is forged, but understanding that, oh yeah, I did do that. And so maybe just because somebody says something, does it. And Pamela puts in scheduling appointments with a guidance counselor for the group work or the group or a group meeting. Groups get canceled. Because at the beginning we were pushing on, right? It was something like different sources will have different pieces, different memories will have different pieces. And then I kept talking about like that written piece. But in the end, the written piece is not infallible either. And I love having them look through their own student planner as a way to really help push that point home. Observations and inferences with artifacts, something I've talked about before. I even went in and switched the artifact. Normally I use the ration tag from Native American tribes in the 1880s. It's the same idea. This is Susan B. Anthony's gavel when she was head of the National Women's Suffrage Association. So this is part of the Smithsonian collection, some of her notes and her gavel. And again, if we were doing this interactive right now, I would say, so what do you see and what do you observe? And again, in one of our previous sessions, we did this. But it's the idea that you can do it with anything. It doesn't always have to be that ration tag. It doesn't always have to be something from the Smithsonian. It can be anything. Because oftentimes, if we just stop and look at something in a way we haven't looked at it before, we will learn something that we didn't know. And this is a collection, a picture I found of just older toys. But what are some things that they may have in their house that they see every day that if they took a minute to flip it over, look behind it, turn it around, that they might learn something completely new just because they looked? So feel free in the chat box or unmute yourself. What is something you can have your kids have of their own artifact? Take a closer look. Pamela says photos of family events. We'll get to photos in just a second, Pamela, but don't lose track of that.
Items that are on the refrigerator.
Can you tell me more? Like what type of items?
Like it could be anything. I mean, I know on my refrigerator I have like sticky notes and pictures and magnets, and the magnets could come from trips or like little love notes, or they become part of your house, so you don't really look at them, you just get used to seeing them. So it could be something that they have to actually look at and then ask questions about, like where did it come from, why is it there, why is this stack of recipes attached to the refrigerator instead of in the pile over on by the stove, or something like that.
I like that recipe one because, so my inference would be those might be ones that the family uses more often, but maybe not. Maybe it meets a special dietary concern that when somebody comes over, we know that these are the recipes we need to use. I mean, it's right. So then you could just ask, try to figure out why is that like that. I like both Leslie and Cindy kind of hit on the same idea of the fridge contents, fruit and vegetables. Where's the food coming from? Years ago, where was I? It was like an antique place or whatever. And I was looking at something and I flipped it over and it said made in China. And right or wrong, it completely changed my entire view of what that is. It was like, oh, Okay, maybe not, never mind. I don't know. Like, so should that matter? I don't know. But I feel like if I hadn't noticed it, right, like there's meaning to that. Craig says the clothing, the tools, where are the things coming from? Something that might not necessarily be easily advisable, but like flip your couch over. What's on the bottom of your couch? Right? It's there every day. We've probably never looked at it once. The old, do not remove tag under penalty of law, or whatever. Are those tags still there? Does anybody know why they're there? What's the purpose of them? And I'm not saying everything you look at and flip over is going to be this new amazing piece, but it will give you a reason to stop and examine the world. So like Jen had said, is it the recipes that are here? What's on the refrigerator? How did it get there? What's in the refrigerator for food, et cetera, et cetera. So here's usually my go-to, and Leslie had mentioned before about doing this. So I take images, and this goes back to, who had said it? Pamela said the photos, because I like to take visual images and not just look at it as the whole, but we really deep dive into it. So I love to chop things into pieces and force you to go deep into this. So in a lot of my professional development, I will start with this piece, because it seems like no matter how many times I've done it, there's still at least half the people have never seen me do this yet. And I always talk about this painting that we are all so familiar with and we know very little about, that we haven't taken the time to notice things about pushing on the ice. Some of my favorites, is that an African American? Why is the guy who's doing the work barehanded and the guy supervising have gloves on? That there's horses in the background of the painting. I'll shoot as soon as I don't know if on my end, my little taskbar came across. There's cannons back there, there's horses, there's boats that go back forever. Is that a woman? Are they injured? Is he a frontiersman? Right? There's just so many different components that I found over and over again. If I ask people who've seen this painting, they say, yeah, I've seen it. And then I take the painting off and I tell them to tell me about it. And people don't know anything. They know George is on it. It's on a boat. But they never see the horses. They never see the cannons. They are vastly wrong with the number of people and the number of boats, because we take this snapshot, we see it, we go, oh yeah, we've seen it before. And we don't do anything. We kind of know there's George, but that's about it. And that's the same thing that you can do with a photo. Super simple. I've shown Glenn Weeby's frame before. But have your kids take a piece of paper and cut a hole in it, punch a hole in it, the size of a quarter, something like that, and then just lay it on top of a photo or a painting. So whatever, I don't know what's behind this, but I have to focus on this part of it. I have to stop. What do I see right in here? That's it. I'm not trying to look at the whole painting or photo. So if we go back to Pamela's suggestion, if we just had a piece of paper with a small hole, or a piece of cardboard where we cut a small hole, anything so we only can look at a small piece. And if you were to look at family photos that are hanging or up in your house right now, or your students' houses right now, if they were to look at it a small piece at a time, what would they see? What would they see for the first time that they never saw before? So what else besides, and I know it's a pretty broad category like photography or art, but what else could you see with your students, doing with your students to have them take that closer look at some sort of art or photography that's up in their house? How do you have them engage with the photography, again, that they see every day?
I would ask them to look behind it, not like in the background, not the foreground, like with the actual, like often there are pictures. I'm just thinking of like the pictures in my home of my son. You can always tell that it's the main person, but if you're looking behind it, try and figure out where it's taken, the location. So most of the time it's taken at like Bar Harbor, or I have to look beyond it to figure out where it was, then it will recall the memories of where we were, what we were doing, who we were visiting, like that moment in time, space.
So we have look behind the main person or focal point. Got that. Look to see who created or took it. I like Jen's idea a lot, because that idea, I think she makes a good point. She's talking about her son, right? Picture of her son, picture of her son, picture of her son. But if you ignore that part, I think what I'm hearing her say is like the whole story is not her son in the foreground, but it's everything else behind it that's like, oh yeah, that was this trip, that was this trip. Like that would become the story of her and her son, is putting those pictures together by remembering what's in the background. But I'm also curious, I know with me, a lot of times I just take the new school picture and put it in front of the old one. And then like you could peel back and see that type of stuff, or look at who created, who took it. One of my colleagues was in a meeting. She said over the weekend, she went through all their old storybooks or photo books. And she said that she realized that she might be the only one of her siblings who writes on the backs of photos, because she would put like dates and stuff on it, but nobody else did. And like, what's the role? And I was like, oh, we're talking primary sources. I'm so excited. But right, like that makes a difference. What might you find on the back part of it? Cindy says, what if you remove the heads of people and figure out who the person is? Gender, age, and expressions. Oh, that's a fun activity. Look at pictures, have an adult cover up the head and see if they can figure out, because you're gonna have to look at all sorts of context clues about that. Leslie has a contextualization piece of before and after. Which photographs were before you were born? Do you know the people, stories, or events of the photos that you are not in? I like that one, Leslie. That was always one of my favorites, going to my grandparents' houses, was to go look at all the photos. Like, who's that? Who's that? Tell me
So I have
about
to
them.
tell you, we just packed up my mother-in-law's apartment beginning of the week, actually. And she has 9 children. My husband's the youngest of 9. And on her wall, there's an array of 3 by 3 of each of the 9 kids. And it's their senior pictures from high school. And for as long as I've known her, wherever she lived, she had up those 9 pictures of her 9 kids on their senior pictures. Well, we took them down, and we're going to send them back to each kid in the mail, and realized every year school picture before it, just like you said, Joe, is in that same frame. So my husband had never seen pictures of his older siblings when they started school, kindergarten stuff, and we could go through and look at those. And it was an amazing journey, and just regrettable in that Mary wasn't there to tell us the stories about it, but what a find. It was quite a find.
I wonder if that's a generational thing, because I grew up remembering that my dad's parents had all of the 6 kids up with their senior photos, and we had a really, really nice thing 3 years ago back, that my grandfather was not doing well and grandma was getting moved out of the house and stuff like that, and we did group photos where it was all of the children holding their senior photos with mom and dad. And then if they had children, the oldest and the siblings, so then there's me holding my dad's senior photo in the picture down and stuff like that. And so actually then after that, my dad's like, I don't want it, you can have it. So I have my dad's senior photo hanging with me. So yeah, and then my stepmom, she has all of her siblings have their senior photos, and then it's kids underneath it. So then if they got married, it's their marriage and then school kids. So it's like a family tree, but I've never thought to do such a great piece. I like what Pamela put in the chat box, looking around. Sometimes there are landmarks and pictures that cease to exist, the history of it. Where was this taken? What's happened? Etc. too. So talking about visual texts and maps, and again, I am going to give Jen credit here for stealing this idea that there's so many things that we need to look at with maps, and the idea that kids can draw their own. And so I know from Jen's choice board, there's the idea of drawing the fire escape of the house, but you still have to have these layered pieces in there. What type of map is it? Oh, it's our fire escape plan. What are the common features of the map? What is the source? How do you do, right? These lines and colors and things mean something. And we oftentimes take for granted that kids understand that, especially in the age of Google, where we don't have to do a lot of that hand map piece, right? We just, I'm here, I want to go here, and that's done, having to understand the symbols. So an elementary student, you could have them create a fire plan map of their house. Thank you, Jen, for allowing me to steal that idea. What's something else you could ever do, especially secondary? What's a way to have your students work with a map as their own primary source?
We have an open concept school. So one of the things that I've had them do is make maps for freshmen about how to get around in our building. It's really confusing.
We have doing a scavenger hunt. So we've got the instructions helping freshmen around, having kids lay out a scavenger hunt, right? Even if they can't leave their own house, they could do a scavenger hunt for a younger sibling or.
I had, so another idea I have on one of my choice boards is the students have to, there's the going along with the scavenger hunt, but they have to write directions on how to find the items that they have hidden. Yeah, I don't know how else to explain it, but they have to give like step-by-step directions on how to find the items that they have on that scavenger hunt.
Pamela says, at the beginning of the year, I have my students make maps of the school unified arts wing. When I was in the classroom, I was student council advisor, and we had like a student council advisor meeting something. And one of our local schools had said that they were having problems with kids getting to class on time. And the kids said, well, it's a one-story building. It's too far. It's too far. And so the student council did a series. They had a map and video PSA where the bell rings and the kids on one end of the building, and they it's fast forward it, but they have tips. When the bell rings, get your stuff up and leave at this point, down the hallway. Avoid talking to your best friends. Oops, there's a line at this water fountain. There's one around the corner. And so the videos, then they have the map laid next to it, right? So they did the maps of where the bathrooms are, where the hallways are, where the water fountains are, and how you attacked it. And so then they went from the furthest classroom to the furthest classroom in like 2 minutes and 45 seconds, showing that the idea of the size of the school did not matter as long as you left when the bell rang, didn't sit and chat with your friends, didn't, do whatever. So it was a good piece. And it was centered around the map piece as well. So there's always different ways, right, to make it meaningful. So whether it's their own school that they're doing stuff for, so Bree, the kids helping the freshmen, whether it's their own scavenger hunt, I like Jen's that next level of giving those directions, right? Because then how do you draw something out, but how do you turn that into words? Because having to describe a map, I know where I'm from, and the joke always was, in Wisconsin, we never measure things in miles. Everything's measured in minutes. Well, you go about 5 minutes, and then you're going to see Tom Jones' barn. You're going to take a left at Tom Jones, and then there's going to be Frank's old place. There's nobody there anymore. But you know Frank, right? And you take a right. Like, if you don't know who any of those people are, you're in trouble. But that's how things get described out, that now, Google will just tell you, take a right. Have your students be an archaeologist. Nope, wrong one. Not like that. Like this. This is what archaeologists do. They don't find treasure. They find things in the ground and they have to piece together the story. Have the kids tell the story on what they find in the garbage. Now, you may not want to be clear and say like, okay, well, throw the banana peels away, do this, do that. I've told teachers before, gather up some of your stuff and bring it in. But what story could be told from your garbage can, or if a little neater one on the webinar I did, somebody suggested their purse.
So can I interject on this? Sorry,
No,
I have to go. I have a team meeting, but so one of my students has been journaling about this because in her backyard, they found a bed. She's got like a whole list of things that they have found, and she's making the assumption that there used to be like an old farmland or something. It's a new development. All the houses are brand new. But they found like a bed frame, a tractor. So she's been telling me about all these new things that as they're finally getting to explore their backyard that they're finding. And she's making assumptions on what happened to this land and where these people are going. So it's been really neat, because when at first she was like, I found a bed frame in my backyard, and I'm like, you found what? And then I found there was like I can't remember, it's like she's been adding to the list of things that she's finding in her backyard. And at first I was a little worried about the bed frame, but as she's going on and telling me that they're exploring the road and these, this wooded area, that it does sound like there used to be a farm or like I don't know, something in this area. So I told her that now her and her mom have to look it up and find out what the history is of that area in Ellsworth. So it's just neat. They just kind of do it on their own without having to be told, I guess.
I think if you find something super, clear and exciting like that, but I think there's so many opportunities. Cindy said the paper recycle bin. I mean, what's in the paper recycle bin? When somebody suggested purse, I thought that was a good idea. It probably smells a little better than the garbage. And somebody else had said like your car, right? I don't think anybody keeps a flawlessly clean car. If you just went into someone's car and you gathered everything out of the car and laid it out, what's the story? And again, think about that observation versus inference, right? If the kids know their story, it's going to be hard, but they can only tell the story in what they see. They can't be like, well, we eat McDonald's all the time. Well, there's no McDonald's wrappers. Yeah, but I know we do. No, what's in here? If there's one Dunkin' wrapper, then you have to make that assumption that it's Dunkin', not McDonald's. Cindy says, I've done archaeological simulations, 1 yard square sheets of craft paper with objects. Each layer represents different periods. Cindy, would you like to tell the group more about that? You don't have to. I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, I had to get my unmute. So I would say it was a colonial period. The top layer would have images from the State Museum, going to name memories, getting things that were in the public domain to represent maybe the 50s, 1950s. The students would record what they found, think about who might have been using that space, how the space was being used, time period. Pull back that layer, you have another layer, maybe from the 1820s. And you kind of just repeat that, do it 3 different times. So the students are aware of the objects and how they speak in terms of function, routine, ages, gender, things to that effect.
So if I'm hearing you, it's a flat sheet of paper with like images and stuff that okay, so then you just keep folding back. Okay, gotcha. I like that idea. I might steal that. You might hear that in a future webinar. But I just love the idea. Like that's what, because I said at the beginning, it's about what those people do. And that's what an archaeologist does. They would take, for lack of a better word, a pile of garbage and be like, okay, let's figure it out, right? It would take that 1 by 1 yard square sheet of pictures, of images, and have to tell the story of it. And kids have those examples in their room, if they're not cleaning their room, cars, purses, refrigerators, as mentioned earlier, garbage, etc. Have them try to, but you have to make sure that it's that observation and not an inference. They can only work with what's actually in there. And so again, when you're working with primary sources, it's not always going to go well. So be okay with that. Use what's already out there. You don't have to create everything new. You can use Cindy's idea, for example. Whatever you use to do in classes, just keep doing that. If you've never done small group work, don't start doing small group work. If you've never done individual work, don't start, right? You're going to build it into the patterns of what they're doing. Graphic organizers are fantastic. The Library of Congress and the National Archives have both elementary and secondary sets along with others. But I got ahead of myself. There's the familiar structure. And use it to review student thinking. I would just keep saying, so Leslie, well, why'd you come up with that? Right? I don't have an answer. I just want to know, what were they thinking about that they processed along the way? Why does Bree's map look that way for the freshmen versus over here? Well, because I think freshmen, they're not going to know. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing. I want to hear that part of it. And you're going to spend more time and you're not going to cover as much, and that's okay. I feel like I just have to tell people to, raise your right hand. I will not cover as much content, because you can't. I feel like I have to tell people that all the time. A lot of people teach the Civil War in 3 or 4 weeks. You know, and I say Gettysburg is a semester course, you know, in colleges somewhere, right? And you're not covering everything. You are making decisions already. And so that's okay to sometimes cover a little bit less. And I can do, we roll into office hours here in a minute. If you want to hear more about how I structure like voice and choice, you know, to give them those basics and then allow them to flow around it, because you can still cover a lot of stuff. It just doesn't have to be led by you. But that is the end of my session here. Is there any questions specific related to the presentation that we want to get recorded before I hit stop?